Welcome back, everyone, to our Playful Horizons speaker series. Thank you all for joining us on a Wednesday evening, and thank you so much to our speaker Rose for being here. Some really quick housekeeping before we get started. First of all, Kenzie is not here today, and so Evan has graciously volunteered to be Kenzie for the day. So everybody say thank you, Evan, slash Kenzie. And today we have a pleasure of speaking with Rose Bigheart O'Leary, a media scholar and educator in several overlapping fields, including informatics, learning sciences, cultural studies, film, environmental education, and Indigenous and decolonial studies. She studies the intersection of media, games, computer facilitated interaction, TV, film, journalism, literature, education, and society. And her specialty is in Turtle Island Indigenous and non-colonial perspectives and theories. She has taught classes in games education, film, writing, cultural studies, and Indigenous history. And she is currently working on a book based on one of her master's theses titled The Regnarrative, Stories for Survivance. Regenerative! Oh, I pronounced that wrong, but the pun is so good.
It's okay.
It's so good. The Regenerative. Beautiful. Rose, that is such an impressive rap sheet right off the bat. So many things you do.
Thank you.
We're really excited to have the chance to chat with you. And if you develop questions for Rose as we go along here, just remember there is a thread of speaker questions up top, and we will be fielding those after about the first half hour. We get through a couple of questions that we put together for Rose. So first of all, welcome, Rose. As I mentioned, everybody spam your favorite emoji in the chat to say hello. And Rose, to get us started here, normally we start these interviews by asking what got you into game scholarship, but you've actually moved back and forth between the game industry and academia a whole bunch over the years. So could you tell us a little bit about your background, both studying and making games, and what landed you where you are now? And we'd also love to know a bit about how your background as a maker and practitioner gets balanced in the work that you do, how you see those things informing each other.
Sure. Yeah, I actually went to undergrad for film. So I went to film school at USC and graduated with a production degree in television and cinema. But right when I graduated, there weren't really any jobs in television or film. We were the industry was recovering from a labor strike, and a friend of mine was like, "Hey, I got a job over at Activision, and they're hiring like." And I mean, it was at the point of like, I will do literally anything. But I had enjoyed and played video games for a long time and was really interested in them, so like, of course. And so I started at Activision as a tester. And these were back in the days when, most of the time now testing is outsourced. But back then you could actually kind of go from testing upward in the company. And I ended up just kind of staying in games. I was an associate producer at the time that I actually left games. So I worked for Activision for a while. Then I moved over to a startup called Jamdat, which doesn't exist anymore because it was purchased by Electronic Arts. So then we got grandfathered in as EA employees. So then I worked also for EA for a while. And I worked in the mobile division mostly. So making games for phones, which, maybe isn't as exciting as working on like a AAA console or a PC title. But it is interesting in that in the mobile division, you get to do a lot more of the jobs rather than having just one category that you work in. So you get to wear like a lot of hats. So you get to kind of be a producer, a designer, a manager, like, and sort of whatever skill set you have, like kind of just gets utilized. So yeah, that's where I worked. I burned out really hard as an EA employee. It wasn't a great place to work. I have heard that some of the cultures at games industry jobs have improved, probably due a lot to, kind of bad reputations for poor working conditions and then also unionization. So, but I haven't been back. I just kind of, couldn't deal with the stress and the pace and kind of poor working conditions for any longer. And I had always sort of thought about going back into academia. I have always been really interested in story and how story works. And, I'm Osage, Cherokee, Quapaw, and Micmac, and I was raised very much with Indigenous culture and community and ethics and kind of philosophies. And in those philosophies, story is kind of considered very much like a backbone of many things, particularly learning. It's the main avenue for like every kind of teaching and learning that goes on there. And so I sort of pivoted into going into graduate school with kind of this overall goal of like maybe merging the two things. Because one of the things that I noticed is that I had a lot of people from my home community and kind of just kids that I knew from around reaching out to me for help with their studies. And I noticed that many of them were doing online learning programs at various different levels, high school equivalency, college, certification, like all of these different things. And I started kind of digging into what was out there in terms of online learning. And I was appalled that most of these online learning systems that I was seeing people using weren't really utilizing what I knew was possible with the technology that we have. Having worked in the video game industry and knowing what was possible, I was kind of like, why aren't we using these great tools that we have in gaming in learning environments for which they would be really useful? And so I kind of tailored my grad school journey around kind of collecting all of these different pieces that I thought I might need with kind of this goal in mind of maybe improving online learning. And as I've sort of gone through this, I've realized that I've taken a lot of investigatory looks at media and story and fun and play and kind of its relationship, right, to technology and how we use it. And I think, one of the things that I'm working with now is I'm kind of like, who decided that we had this idea that learning had to be completely divorced from all of the other aspects of life, from play, from joy, from fun, from, and even to a certain extent from technology. Like even the learning systems that use technology seem to kind of hate technology and are really, really slow to adopt like some of the innovations and new features that are available and that could be useful. Like there's kind of this inherent Luddite impulse where it's like, no, we must just be a library on the internet and that's it.
Right.
So it's been a journey. I don't see myself going back to industry because I'm really invested in what I'm doing now. But I do kind of see my role after I graduate as kind of being a bridge type person between sort of the ways that we use technology seriously and the ways that we use technology for fun. And I would really like to see that categorization and border erased more and become more permeable.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us, and also like what an exciting combination of experiences. And I'll just say, as somebody who teaches games and game design, you'd be surprised how often I find resistance from colleagues or from supervisors, and adding play into the classroom. Like you would be startled at how many like game instruction courses can be just horribly dry, and it's like, what are we doing here? Yeah. Fantastic. So on that note, then there's so many different questions we could ask. So I'm going to try and speed through the ones we have here, because I know there are a few students who are going to have some questions. You've done some really amazing work on the ways that settler colonialism is often embedded into narrative structures and storytelling in mediums like games, and the alternatives that Indigenous worldviews can offer. We would love to hear more, and I imagine this is a particularly fitting discussion with all the hype around Civilization 7 357 swirling around. And we've talked a bit in my class, and I believe those in 351 are also talking a bit about how land is represented in games and how strategy games like 4X games can reinforce the logics of settler colonialism. But do you want to talk to us a bit about other ways that these logics appear, maybe in places we might not expect?
I mean, one of my master's degrees is in Indigenous Studies and Cultural Studies. And for my thesis, I really looked at, kind of foundational elements of storytelling. And I think one of the things that we don't realize is that I think a lot of kind of our grappling with difference has been at a very surface and cosmetic level, right? So we see a lot of efforts at representation. And we see a lot of efforts at, we see a lot of calls for we need more voices of diversity making product, right? Making media. And I don't argue against either of those things. I think both of those things are very, very good things to do. But I think there's another layer too. And I think one of the other layer, and the one that I write about and the one that I'm really interested in, is, we often see these foundational assumptions of colonialism repeated. And they get repeated in kind of this offhand way. So they become a framework within which we work. And so once we have that framework in place, it makes it sort of impossible to operate outside of it. So some of the pillars of colonial narrative are individualism, excess, or an idea that we have sort of a world of infinite resources, infinite people, infinite everything, right? And that we also we see these purity versus disposability narratives. Everything is great until it's not, and then you throw it away and you replace it with something new. Also kind of known as frontier narratives, right? We can always just move on to a new frontier. We can ruin wherever it is that we're living now because we can just go to the next frontier. Or if we outgrow where we're living now, we'll go to the next frontier, and that's good, right? That's very much framed as good. And we sort of see these foundational assumptions of infusing all kinds of narratives that we tell in games, narratives that we tell in stories, and narratives that we tell even in educational contexts. The other one is sort of this march of civilization idea, this idea that we came from Stone Age people, and then we discovered fire, and then we learned how to cultivate crops. And then we learned how to make factories, and then we learned how to make computers, and that's a natural progression that everybody would have gone through, and that does go through, and that it's good, right? Like, it's just inherently good. You hear it all the time, but you don't want to stand in the way of progress. But my big question is kind of like, well, progress towards what? We need to know where we're going. What is that progress actually leading to? Because it's sort of taken as an inherent good, right? And so you see these assumptions kind of infusing games. So my big beef with civilization, and there are many, is yes, first of all, it doesn't treat land as relative, it treats land as property, right? And it doesn't come from a foundational assumption that other people populate land. It comes from this assumption that you are a colonist, colonization is good, you should go grab as much land as you possibly can, and it's a good thing to run off other people or absorb them or exterminate or eliminate them, right? It basically advocates colonialism and the genocide that accompanies it. But even deeper than that, it kind of has this foundational assumption that everybody would have and does act the same way, given the same circumstances, the same collection of resources, the same sort of, that even all research and technology would always inevitably follow the same path no matter what, right? And so that doesn't allow for us to examine how other cultures might work, how other civilizations might and do work. And my big issue with this is sort of if the point of teaching history, which a lot of people say civilization's so great because it gets people excited about history. Okay, well, if the point of teaching history, if you use the old cliche, it's to keep us from repeating the mistakes of the past. Where does civilization land us in the future? What are the options for the future that civilization gives us? At the current point with Civilization 6, all of the wins are things that would wreak devastating consequences on the people on the planet and the people who live on it, right? They all require excess accumulation or some form of domination, which I kind of argue excess accumulation is a form of domination, right? Things that we have historically as a species sort of said aren't okay. We said it wasn't okay for Napoleon to take over the world, Hitler to take over the world, all of these big villains in our history. But then we're playing this game and saying it's a great historical tool that encourages you to be that megalomaniac who takes over the world and has all of the money and has all of the resources. And then, there's also a problem with treating the earth as if it's a collection of resources rather than an interconnected web of life, which we know and is scientifically proven is how it actually operates. So if you mess up that web of life, you're also messing up your own habitat, right? So this isn't just about don't be selfish and greedy and mean and awful to other people. It's also about your own survival. Because if you kind of destroy your own ecosystem, then you have nowhere left to live. And sort of the pushback on this is like the science victory in civilization, right? People are like, oh, but you can just go do science and that's neutral. Well, no, it's not. And in civilization, it kind of, it sells this dream of like, well, the ultimate science victory is you build a rocket and you can go colonize space. Well, we know from all of the best models that it's absolutely not going to be possible to colonize space before climate change kills us all if we don't put it in check.
Right.
And there's kind of no representation of that in the game. I don't have a lot of hope that it will be in Civ 7. I think they will probably make some token efforts at it because they have been criticized so strictly, but I don't know exactly where it will go. And I think, again, it goes back to those foundational assumptions. If you assume that you have this world full of disposability and that you can always just throw away and move on to something new, if you're operating from a premise that you're not striving for balance or harmony in a place that you cannot escape and that you do need to reckon with, that changes the entire picture of the story that game mechanic is framed in, right? And I think that we need to think more deeply about those things rather than sort of saying, well, we just need to add more characters who look differently. Right. Well, does it matter if they look differently if they're going to behave the same? Mm-hmm. Right? They have the Haudenosaunee started being represented in Civ 5, except the Haudenosaunee also have to behave like colonizers. They have the Cree Nation represented in Civ 6, except the Cree Nation has to behave as colonizers. And even their descendants spoke out, and there wasn't all of these news stories, and they complained because one of their relatives is like the leader of the Cree civilization, and they were like, no, that's not okay. Like, we are not colonizers. We have been very much damaged by colonization, and our relative absolutely would not behave in this way. But there isn't an option for them to behave differently, right? So we don't get to play out any future scenarios that give us any other options. And I think that that's very psychologically harmful. So we see from cultural studies and we also see from psychological research that not being able to envision a positive possible future sort of paralyzes people for action. It creates depression, it creates inaction, it creates this kind of paralysis, right? And so if we start foreclosing on any possibility but behaving in a way that is destructive, then we are foreclosing on even our capacity to kind of imagine future scenarios. So you see a lot of future stories that are like very much one end of the spectrum or the other. Most of them are apocalyptic. Most of them are extremely grim, right? And many of them replay frontier scenarios. They're sort of hopeful for some kind of apocalypse because, okay, then we can go back to something we know. It's a zombie apocalypse and we have to rebuild, right? Or they're very utopic. They're Star Trek. We live in a new, which is still has frontier narratives in it, but it, it says we've transgressed, or we've transcended the need for money. Everybody has universal basic income, and everybody just does what they should do for work and that kind of thing. But it doesn't really have any steps to how we get there. It's just sort of yeah, at one point in the past, we figured it out and we fixed it and now we're good. And so it's just this deus ex machina, this magic wand of fixing things. And so, I think if we start with foundational assumptions that are kind of the opposite of these things, right? Collective mindsets and behaviors. Maybe even distributed heroics. I think heroes are a huge problem, singular heroes and singular villains. Instead, showing people that maybe are more human, have some good things that they do, have some bad things that they do, have some positive qualities, have some weaknesses, and showing people succeeding through collective action, rather than waiting for Harry Potter to show up and be the chosen one and fix it all. I think that those are some really good ways to tell not just anti-colonial stories, but just non-colonial stories. They don't have to be directly opposite and resisting colonialism, to just be something else, to be non-colonial.
I think that's some really fantastic practical advice for our students as they think about their own games, and a really important point, I think, about the ways that certain mechanics create stories where, no matter what you do, the science tree is still going to end in building giant death robots. And what are the implications of this thing?
Right.
I'm going to be thinking in particular about that idea of excess and how many games play into that kind of maximalist power fantasy. I think that's something we see really often across genres. Definitely something for us to think about. And this actually gets us into another question we had here, because something we've talked about a lot is how game developers are trying sometimes to decolonize game traditions, but often the buck stops there. And you've written and spoken pretty extensively about how it's not only important to decolonize games, but to meaningfully understand alternative practices and put them into action. And I think you've touched a bit on this here, but can you tell us a little bit more about the direction that work is going in, and what other strategies or games or traditions are there out there that we should be paying attention to?
Sure. The scholars Tuck and Yang sort of famously wrote a journal article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor in 2012. And they were kind of pushing back on people. Decolonization had become this really popular buzzword, and so many people were using it, and they were kind of pushing back on particularly non-Indigenous people, sort of claiming that they had accomplished decolonization, like they had decolonized their classroom. And Tuck and Yang's point was just kind of we need to be careful with throwing this term around, because what is actual decolonization? So according to Tuck and Yang, actual decolonization is, land rematriation. It's actually giving the land back. So you can't just put the chairs in your classroom in a circle and be like, decolonization is done. I did it, And so, but I do think that there are steps towards decolonization efforts, right? We can't claim to be completely there, and we need to be very wary of claiming that we are there. Because then we get into an area of, again, that's a very colonial idea that sort of we have these linear goalposts that we need to reach. And once we've reached them, we don't have to think about them anymore, right?
Yeah.
Once we have accomplished all of the check boxes for decolonization, then we're done. And, instead, I would argue that a non-colonial sort of foundational way of thinking is instead thinking about balance and how that's a processual and continual thing. It's a lot of work to maintain balance, and it requires maintenance. It's not just an accomplishment. If you think about maybe trying to stand on a round surface like a ball or a log or something like that. You don't just do it and then boom, it's done. If you want to maintain it, you have to be adjusting your body and adjusting your muscles kind of constantly, maybe in very minute ways. That's what I mean by processual. And it's also sort of this idea that we are always growing and we are always learning, right? We don't really stop. Like, that's not a thing you can turn off. You're always taking in information. You're always sort of processing. You're always sort of you're always kind of growing and developing new ideas, whether you like it or not. It's just part of being alive and having a brain. And so I think, recognizing that and being very careful with kind of decolonization, it's one of the reasons why I sort of push forward these ideas of like, I think that there's kind of components to decolonization. So I break it down to desettling, regeneratives, and survivance. So, desettling is what we usually think of as decolonization. It's where we sort of recognize something as colonial and do something to upset it, right? Or remove it. But we also see, many scholars, particularly post-colonial scholars, have kind of commented on, you can't just focus on taking away the colonial. You also got to think about what you want instead. And that's where I think regeneratives come in, or regenerative narratives. It's kind of mashed together to be one word, right? These are the stories of the things we want to grow and the things that we want to see, right? So we also need to think about the world that we want, not just the stuff that we don't want. And I think regeneratives are a really powerful tool, right? And then also survivance is this notion. It was first put forward by the scholar Jacques Derrida, but then it was picked up by Gerald Visner, an Ojibwe scholar, who he has many different definitions of survivance, and he uses it very much in the realm of literature and storytelling. But I think it's really valid in a lot of other areas as well. And so, the kind of simple explanation of survivance is it's not mere survival. It's also the insistence on living, right? So it's not just grim determination to stay alive, right? It's also insisting on enjoying life, and refusing to let that be taken away, and having that be kind of a point of resistance and a point of refusal as well. Like, no, we're also going to tell we're not just going to tell stories about being victims. We're also going to tell stories about what we think is important and what we like about ourselves and what we enjoy, right? And how we live, and those things which make life worth living. So I think in many ways that's kind of that antidote to that super depressing, like hopeless, like we're playing out futures that can't really exist, or if they do, it's going to be awful, is kind of maybe this survivance mentality of, let's think about what makes life worth living, and let's portray that as a future scenario, and how we can think about how we can get there. And I think the other pushback always in games is kind of like, oh, but that's not fun. That can't be fun, or it's not going to be challenging enough. And I'm kind of like, no, balance and making sure that everybody's needs are met is way harder than just collecting all of the stuff and becoming king of the hill. Like, that's a much more complicated game, and it's more difficult. And I would argue that therefore it's probably going to be more fun, because it's going to be novel, and it's going to be a lot of new skills and managing a lot of things all at the same time, instead of following the same linear trajectory of let's just collect all of the stuff and then proclaim ourselves king, right? But yeah, I think that we should really be paying attention to sort of token representation, and be wary of it, be willing and able to recognize it. Unfortunately, I don't know of a lot of funding going into games that are kind of following these different patterns. I know there's analog games. There's one called Potlatch, which is sort of interesting, and We All Take from the River is also very interesting. Elizabeth LaPonce does some interesting turns in that she just kind of takes classic video game mechanics, but then slaps like Indigenous story on them. And it's really interesting to see those mechanics play out in a different wrapping, and how that changes your perception of game worlds and gameplay. When Rivers Were Trails is probably her best known, but she's done a few others as well.
Yeah, well, that's terrific.
Sorry, I don't know if that answered the whole question. I kind of tangented there.
No, that was that was exactly on topic. I think you answered that question and a good chunk of the next one that I had, and I think this is really valuable for us in particular, thinking, as game designers, and especially for our students who, are wrestling with the fact that how do we make space for games and play in a world that is a lot at times? This is a thing I think, yeah, all of us are having to contend with. And so finding alternative narratives and different things to prioritize, like all of this is really valuable. And I do want to ask one last question, just because it's such a instrumental part of your work. We wanted to ask a bit about your experience with education and games. Obviously, those of us up here are game educators, but that's very different than thinking about how learning and games are entangled. And I know for a lot of students here who are either students in an education environment or may go on to be and collaborators and mentors and things like that. Can you share a little bit with us about your work on games and education and design?
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of think games and education, well, maybe not education. Education kind of implies a sort of institutional thing.
Fair enough.
I would say learning.
Yeah.
I think games and learning are intrinsically intertwined. And I don't think you can separate them from one another, in spite of kind of everyone's best efforts to do so sometimes. If you really think about how games work, they're all about learning. Like, there's all kinds of learning that go on in games. And often the games that we cherish the most are the ones that make us learn the most. And that have the most stuff for us to learn, and new content, right? But then we also see kind of this stall out. So I think it's interesting also to know kind of the genealogy of games and learning. So right now I'm advised by Kurt Squire, who with whom I fundamentally disagree about many, many things, including the game Civilization. But to his credit, he still manages to be an extremely good advisor to me.
That's impressive.
Yes, and he and then Constance Steinkuhler is also a person that I work with pretty closely, and they were both advised by James G., who literally wrote the book about games and learning. But then he, in turn, was one of his main mentors and advisors was Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky, is known for kind of being this commentator on kind of like political life and human behavior, and being very far to the left as well, and very progressive in his ideas and his observations about society and kind of these very serious things. And so it's interesting to note that you sort of see this like trajectory, like
Right.
going in and out and weaving its way past, games, and then things that are considered very opposite from games, like very serious stuff about the course of like human history and education and politics and social change and things like that. And I think it's because they're intrinsically linked. I really think that we have this false dichotomy set up between learning and play that just isn't real. And I think maybe you can point to some puritanical roots, particularly in the United States and Canada. And that's kind of a weird offshoot in the course of human history. Like, it's actually not that common to have like a whole culture that's very like anti-joy, right? Like, it's very weird. It's a very strange phenomenon. We don't see it among almost any other people. So it's very strange that that particular really small, distinct kind of offshoot has had such a huge influence even on attitudes that we have today around these things. But then what's also interesting is, there's a lot of people that have tried to like gamify education and make learning games. And like learning games historically always flop. Like people have a lot of trouble making learning games that actually gain traction. There's a new one all the time. There's a bunch of investment. There's a bunch of really talented, smart people constantly trying to make learning games, and they just rarely get taken up. And so there's a lot of scholarship about why that is. And many people kind of point to the chocolate-covered broccoli phenomenon is what it's called, is that you're taking
name.
something that isn't fun, right? And you're trying to coat it in fun, but then you're like mashing together two things that really shouldn't ever be put together, you know? And the user, the player, the person that's supposed to do this thing recognizes it right off the bat and is like, yeah, no, thank you. Like, I'm gonna go over here. Like, if I want nutrition, I'll just eat broccoli. Thanks. And if I want fun, I'll just eat chocolate. Like, stop trying to put them together. So we still sort of see this division. And I think it has something to do with maybe examining our preconceived notions about how learning has to happen, right? Or especially about when you get to like sort of core academic subjects and content knowledge. You know, a lot of people can't envision a different way of learning multiplication because the way that they learned multiplication was by rote and was by memorization, and it was broccoli and it was not fun, and they can't figure out any other way that could ever be done other than having a bear running along a track collecting boards before he falls into a pit, which is just kind of taking a mechanic and like slapping rote memorization into it, and it kind of works. But like, are you really going to get people to pick that up? So I think it's kind of an ongoing conundrum, but I also think that it has to do with a lot of what you were talking about initially, with having a classroom that's fun is a very intimidating prospect for a lot of people who have been formally trained to be an educator, because a lot of our formal training as to be educators has to do with control. And being in control, you know, fun is threatening when you're trying to set up a structure of control, because fun allows for freedom and behaviors that you can't predict and that you aren't necessarily able to corral or keep a lid on or even moderate sometimes. And we sort of see this in education, where we see play-based education is super successful, particularly in some Nordic countries. Finland has switched to a model where it's all play-based education up until like, I don't know, 6th or 8th grade around, you know, like around puberty ages, and it's extremely successful. What I'm interested in is, yeah, okay, but why does that die when we hit puberty? Why is it not okay later on? Like, why is it suddenly kind of grim and serious when we get into our teen, adolescent ages, collegiate levels? And what can we do about it? And I think it really has to do with being brave, and letting education be what people want it to be. And you know, I kind of take the stance with my students where I'm like, you're here for some reason. That reason is your reason. And you can take from this what you want to take from this, and you have the right to self-determine your life and your education and what you're going to learn. There is absolutely no way that I can force you to do that. And I think that re-examining, you know, what are these learning spaces for and what are our goals, and maybe kind of putting them back into the hands of the learners themselves, is one of the directions that we need to go. And for my dissertation, I'm kind of working on the concept of survivance pedagogy wrapped around that, and wrapped around, you know, the idea of maybe having co-designed classrooms where we approach it from that, you know, where the learners come in and we go, okay, what are we going to learn? What are we going to do? And letting that be in their hands. And then also, you know, kind of insisting on making places for being human, for having joy and making connections, maybe even having grief together, and creating a community of the classroom. I taught an online course during the lockdowns, the COVID-19 lockdowns. And, we started just giving over half of the sessions to a game night and letting the game night be student-led if they felt like leading it. And just kind of being like, nope, half of the space is just going to be your space.
Yeah.
Make your community do what you want to do. If you all want to sit around and be silent and play your own games and we'll all just be logged in at the same time, that's fine. Like if we want to do a group game together, that's fine too. If we all will just want to talk about how much we're freaking out, sure, we'll do that. And kind of our bosses were like a little bit like appalled and pushed back a little bit on us for like wanting to do that. But we were just kind of like, you know what? 2 weeks ago, you were ready to cancel this whole thing because you were freaking out about the pandemic. Just like, let us do whatever because you've already like kind of written this program up. So we were able to have the freedom to do that, and it was really interesting because in the end, our learners were so devoted to their projects. We saw a level of learner engagement and investment that was almost scary. We had a kid with appendicitis that insisted on giving his final presentation before he would go complain to his parents that he needed to go to the ER. And we had no idea. He was like, oh, I have a stomachache, but I'm okay. I'm going to explain my game that I made. Like, it's really important. We were just like, and we didn't know until after. We were like, oh my God. Like, no, please go to the hospital if you need to. But I think, it may not seem like it, like from an outsider's perspective, that giving over half your sessions to playing games or letting students do whatever they want might just kind of seem like, well, you're just wasting time. You're not getting to content knowledge. You're not presenting a lecture. You're not forcing them to work on their projects. And it's like, yeah, but we're creating community. We're creating community and we're letting them have agency and we're letting them have self-determination about what and who they are as a community. And that creates more investment in what they're learning and why they're learning it, because it taps into their reason for being there. So I think that that's super important.
Yeah, probably the most important thing. And like as educators, I don't know, I think that's really powerful and calls out something we should all be striving for. I will also point out there was some hype in the chat at the Chomsky mention, so students are excited to see that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I want to make sure we have time for questions for some students. So
Sure.
We're going to do that weird thing where we're going to sign off the recording for those who are watching this in the future. Rose, are there any sort of parting words of advice to emerging game scholars and designers who might be watching this, when they wake up in the morning or next week or even later this month? Things we want to say?
Think about your foundational assumptions. Examine the foundational assumptions that you're starting with and think about, maybe just try one thing that you can do to disrupt or point to a different idea or an alternative to those.